Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. An important part of podcasting is being able to hold space for the person that you're interviewing, whether they're telling you a very detailed story about their life, an emotional story, or you just want to have a good conversation with them. That is what today's episode is all about. I am interviewing my client, Lisa Cooper Ellison, the host of Writing Your Resilience podcast. Lisa and I have been working together since the launch of her show, and she is about a year in, maybe a little bit more. In this episode, Lisa talks all about how she interviews her guests and holds space for them while they're telling her the stories of their life and their memoirs and their books and their writing. She also uses her platform as an educational place for other writers to come and learn more about how to write their story in a true and authentic way. Creating a space for vulnerability, I think, is a place where a lot of us can work on, especially if we are hosting guests on our show. So I know you'll get a lot out of this episode. Whether you're a podcaster, writer, or just someone curious about the intersection of storytelling and healing, which a lot of us are able to get our emotions out through writing. So it's a really good way to process your emotions, as Lisa will tell us. But this episode is packed with so many great and actionable tips. I cannot wait to get into this. All right, enjoy the episode. Hey Lisa, thank you so much for being my guest in the Podcast Cafe. I am so excited to be talking with you about your podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, we've been working together for a while, so it's been exciting to see you on the back end, and now to see you on the front end as a host is just so joyous for me.
Yeah, I love working with you, Lisa. You have an amazing podcast that we're going to be talking all about today. And what you really are doing with your podcast not only feeds into your business, but also you're having these important conversations with authors about their writing processes and these things that they went through. And so I'm excited to be chatting with you, especially about how you hold space for your guest during the interview. That's a skill that you went to school for. You were a therapist, correct? And so that's definitely embedded in what you do as a person, but you bring that to your podcast, which is so amazing. So before we get into all of that, since we are in the Podcast Cafe, I have a very important question for you. What is your go-to coffee order?
Oh, my go-to coffee order would be a venti decaf Americano with cream.
Yum. I always like to hear what people order. It's giving me some new ideas on my coffee order.
There's this wonderful Argentinian coffee place in the town where I live in Charlottesville, and it recently opened up, and they make a fantastic latte. And what I love about this place is you get your coffee, and then you also get this little sparkling water with it, and then there's this little tiny cookie. The attention to detail is so nice. You just feel very held and very cared for.
I love that. I'll have to try that one day. So let's get into more about your podcast. Before we get into what your podcast is, do you mind describing it in 3 words?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I would say the title says it all, Writing Your Resilience.
Yeah, definitely. Tell us more about your show, why you started it, and what you talk about in Writing Your Resilience.
Yeah, so I'm a trauma-informed writing coach, and I've been working as a writer for most of my life, and also I have a background in counseling. I worked as a trauma therapist for a period of time. I have an EDS in clinical mental health counseling, and I always thought that my entire career would be working for a mental health agency and doing that work, and then I ended up getting Lyme disease in 2012. And I became so sick that I couldn't work for a period of time. And while I was sick, it was really this process of getting very clear about what mattered to me, what my soul's purpose is, and then how I would go ahead and manifest that. Because I had always wanted to be a writer. I had always wanted to teach writing. I just didn't think I was good enough. And also, it felt like such a risky endeavor because, anything in the arts is a little unstable. And then, because you also run a business, there's no guarantee, right? Whereas if you work for an agency or you work for someone else, of course, there's not always guarantees. But in general, the harder you work, the more successful you are. And you put in an X number of hours and you get a paycheck. And so there was something very comforting about that. And what I realized when I was sick is that, number one, all of the hard work I'd put into trying to build these guarantees in my life had not created a guarantee because here I was sick and had lost pretty much everything that mattered to me. And also that I was really stealing from the world. And, to speak to what Marie Forleo says, by not offering the world my deepest gifts. And so I decided to build my business, which is a writing business. And so I work largely with memoirists who have tough stories. And I help them tell those stories both as a modality for healing, right? So there's this transformative process that happens when you are writing, but also so that they can publish their work. So it's a both and proposition. And I've been doing this as a freelancer for, I think 8 years now. I've had my business for about 8 years. And as I was thinking about how do I grow this business and connect with more people in a way that feels authentic and a little slower, right? Because when we are on social media, everything is flying by so quickly, and we're scroll. And I have strong feelings about what that does to the brain based on, my prior work. So I wanted something that would allow me to sit down and be present with someone, really understand them through their story, and offer listeners an opportunity to also consume something in a slow way that help them make sense of their experience, help them build some new skills, and help them think through those deep questions that they might have about their story.
Yeah. And I think that's an amazing reason why you started your podcast, because I was thinking about this literally yesterday, where I'm trying to do this short video series about starting a podcast, and getting it under a minute and a half is so hard for me. I love long form content. And the reason I do is because you can get into really the deep topics that you want to get into. You can barely scratch the surface with a minute and a half reels or whatever it is.
Yes.
So especially with a topic as deep as yours, and when you're working with your clients or interviewing your guests, you want to give them the benefit of being able to explain their story. I mean, I'm not a writer, but I know that if I was and I wrote something and people barely asked me about it, that would be really hard for me to feel good about putting such a tough moment of my life out there. You know what I mean? Like, if I was creating some deep artwork of myself and no one appreciated it, I'd be like, well, why would I do this? So giving your audience space, or giving your guests space to be able to share their story, I feel like is not only helpful for your listeners, but empowering for your guests as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important for guests to feel like they've been seen and that they have those opportunities to dive deep into their topic. And one thing that I do, and I get this feedback all the time from my guests, and look, no judging any podcast host. I understand exactly how hard this is and how much energy and time goes into it. So trust me, I feel y'all on this. But something that people say to me is like, I know that you understand my work and I can tell that you've read it. And there are some times when I go on a podcast and I can tell that the host has no idea about what I have created. And we have this really surface level conversation where they gave me a platform to say a few things about what I've created, but it's not really that give and take because they just don't have the capacity or the knowledge to be able to do it.
And Lisa, I can 100% say I've listened to every episode of yours, so that is why we could get deep into this conversation.
That is very true. And I am very grateful for all the hard work you put into the back end to make it so good.
Oh, of course, of course. I really love how with your podcast too, you're creating this community of new listeners and creating a community of writers who want to put out their work. And I know in your episodes, sometimes you even talk about writers who are never going to put out their work. They're just writing it to heal. So can you talk about the community aspect of your podcast and how you're growing it and really why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, there are a few different reasons why I'm trying to grow this community. I mean, there's always the business reason, right? If you are listening to this, you might be a business owner and wondering, how do I get more customers? And so by expanding my reach and setting myself up as a subject matter expert who knows how to bring in other subject matter experts, that helps to create more legitimacy in what I'm doing. And then the more people trust me and they get these little bite-sized snippets of maybe a strategy or a new way to think about something, then they're more likely to want to work with me in some other way. So of course, that is a piece of what I do. I also feel strongly that everyone should have access to information. And you know, there's a period of time in my life where I had nothing. Like literally the clothes on my back, and I was walking out one door and not sure what was going to happen when I got to the next one. And I wanted to write, and I didn't feel like I had access to things. And part of that was because the internet didn't exist back then. I mean, now I'm dating myself here. But I really feel like not everyone can afford to pay for information. Right? We can't all do that. And so the podcast gives me an opportunity to do that, which is part of my mission, to make sure that everyone has access. The other thing is that I'm a writer and we have to have an author platform. And so the more that I grow this community, the more interest there will be in my books. So when I go to sell my books, that's another piece of my business. And also, the more I grow my community, the more I begin to understand who my ideal customer is, what they want, what they need. And that fuels what I put into the podcast. So one thing I'm getting ready to do, which you and I haven't even talked about, is to do a focus group and really tap a number of my avid listeners who I know have been listening for a while and say, what do you want more of in the podcast? What has served you with the podcast? What are you excited about? Because the more I can serve them, the more I really feel like I know I'm doing my job. And I think that's really important because whenever you put out a podcast or a newsletter, which is something else I do, and I'll talk in a moment about the synergy between the podcast and my newsletter, is that there are a lot of times when you just put things out and you have no idea whether it worked, whether it touched anyone, how it's going. And so the more you connect with your community, the more you get that feedback. And you build that feedback loop to be able to understand what's working. And the more you have that, the more motivated you feel to continue to do this work. And it also helps you sharpen the work that you do. And so the questions that I get from listeners and the work that I do when I'm interviewing people also helps with building content for my newsletter. Because some people that I work with, story is their medium. They like to see the written word. And so I always, make sure I have a transcript so that people have multiple ways to access the podcast. But those two things work together because I have this nice content umbrella of writing your resilience. So I can talk about that in a variety of different ways. And so I think those are the ways that they work together. And that's one of the reasons why I'm building my audience the way I am.
Yeah, and you're doing an amazing job at it because what I always think when I think about podcasting is if you have, let's just say, 10,000 listeners who you've never heard from, that's less powerful to me, honestly, than a smaller audience that does interact with you. Like you get comments on your YouTube videos. Part of it has to do with the amazing guests that you bring on as well, of course, but you're fostering these really important conversations that are getting people to talk. So I was talking to another podcaster about wanting to build that, listen to what I just heard on this podcast type of show, where you're educating them and bringing them new ideas, and you're getting them talking, because that to me is such a key part of podcasting. That's really the part where you feel like you are having an impact. You're not just putting out episodes and, kind of trying to see what they want. You're actually knowing that this is what they want. So that group that you're creating, the focus group, that's going to be really interesting to see what episodes resonate best with some audiences, who those audiences are. I think that's going to be really cool, and I can't wait to help you with that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it, because this is what I know in terms of that word of mouth component. Often word of mouth is the most powerful way for anything you do to grow, because people trust people they know, right? You might see something on social media and it goes by, and maybe you see it enough times and you go, oh, that's interesting. But if somebody tells you, you need to listen to this or check this out, you are more likely to do that. And what I find is that the more I ask my listeners, what do you want? What's interesting to you? When I can deliver on it, then they go tell the people they know, like, hey, because they feel like they've been a part of it.
Yeah, totally. And it's kind of like that thought process of, if you can't explain your podcast in a few words, then how is someone else going to explain it? Because when you see a movie and someone says, oh, what's it about? And you're like, how do I explain it? I can't explain it. That's kind of what podcasters want to avoid. But I find that the longer, I find it happens in two spots. Like, either you start too broad or you end up too broad. And being broad is fine. It just depends on the goals that you have for your podcast. So since you have this goal of wanting to get people talking and seeing what they like, you're definitely going down the right path of figuring out who they are and what they want to hear from you.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I also do is, anytime I have a guest, because my guests range from published authors, and that can include bestsellers, people who are emerging authors, and debuts, as well as people in the field of mental health, and occasionally other people who just have incredible stories and maybe they're not writers. I'm always thinking about, how do we use the storytelling process to build our resilience? So anytime I have a guest on, it doesn't matter what they're talking about. I'm always thinking about, how do I bring this back to the core mission of this podcast? So for instance, probably one of the most popular episodes that I have is my interview with Dr. Ramani Durvasula, who is absolutely amazing. If you don't know who she is, you need to look her up right now. And she wrote the book, It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. And so that is a very niche topic, even though it's also a hot topic. But she's also a writer. So we talked about this topic of dealing with narcissistic people, and a lot of memoirists have dealt with narcissistic people, so it's immediately relevant. But I also made sure to talk to her about being a writer and what she learned through the writing process and through, launching a bestseller, which her book was an instant New York Times bestseller, and how did she pull all of that together? So I think when someone's thinking about it, having that umbrella that is broad enough that you can talk about a lot of things, but specific enough that you can always be thinking about your core mission, allows you to steer your conversations so that they're always focusing on what's important to your audience.
Absolutely. And that is a great episode. I'll definitely link it in the show notes for everyone to listen to. But you're so right, because what I always see is, if someone is, as popular as her and a bunch of people want to interview her, a lot of those interviews might sound the same.
Yeah.
So finding your edge and finding what makes you different, which you definitely have done through what you just said, always tying it back to your brand will make it stand out from all the other episodes that she may record.
Yeah.
Another key part of your show is, like I was saying, you hold space for people to be vulnerable. And I know this is embedded in who you are, but I'd love it if you could share some tips with any podcasters who may struggle with this. Emotions make a lot of people uncomfortable. And sometimes, not all podcasts will touch on emotional topics, but sometimes you will, and sometimes you won't even know what will make your guest emotional, right? but
Yeah.
you are talking about emotional topics. So you're the expert in this. Can you give us some tips on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I do have a background in clinical mental health counseling, and I worked with some hardcore professors who were, we talked about such nuanced and what can sound like trivial things. So, for instance, when I was working as a therapist, we would have to film ourselves when we were, you know, early in our training. And we would have these training videos up on this big screen with our professor, and he would be looking for things like, are you shaking your leg? Are your legs crossed? What are you doing with your hands? And the reason I'm talking about this is that what you do can signal your level of comfort. So even if your guest can't see it or it doesn't show up on your podcast at all, if you're fidgeting a lot, that is a signal that you are uncomfortable with whatever's happening in the topic. And so, you know, part of really being able to hold space for people is being able to hold space for yourself and understand when you are comfortable and when you're not comfortable. And it's not a good versus bad kind of situation. It's okay. Everyone has things that make them uncomfortable. The question becomes, how do you sit with it for yourself so that if it comes up in a podcast episode, you know how to sit with it for someone else. So seeing your body as this finely tuned instrument that can help you do that is really important. And for me, mindfulness plays a big role. So that's how I tune into my body. And then there are very simple things you can do. So being comfortable with silence is really important. Now, of course, in a podcast, you don't want the silence to go on too long, but remember, you can edit your podcast. So if the silence goes too long in terms of your episode, you can always edit that back. However, if you cut someone off in the middle of their thinking process, or if they're emoting in some way, you cannot bring that back, right? You can't bring that moment back. So I love what Crystal Profit says she does. She runs the Profit podcast, which is a marketing related podcast, but she actually sits on her hands. And when I was a therapist, especially when I was in training, I would count. Like when someone would pause, I would count to 3. And I still try to do that because that makes space for someone who's processing to continue to share their story, right? Because if you want someone to share more of their story, give them the space to do it. So that's one of the strategies that I use. Also, offering what would be called a minimal encourager. That's what we would call it, right? Like, yeah, like using your face to show that you are with that person can also help. And one of the most important things you can learn to do is to be a reflective listener. And you can practice this in all kinds of situations. And so what reflective listening is where someone says something to you and you repeat it back to them in their own words. When you do that, people feel heard. And the more they feel heard, the more likely they are to share something else that's a little deeper. They're going to trust you more. And so I can talk about the other side of that. Like, you know, there's a space of wanting people to open up. And that is a piece of handling vulnerability. But then how do you keep it from getting too vulnerable, especially when you have someone on camera, you have a certain time frame. We can talk about that, but I'm curious to know if you have any questions or thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really interesting that I move around a lot and I am a very active listener, but that is always something that, like, through podcasting, it's taught me how to slow down, I think. Before I started in the podcast world, definitely I would, like, jump into conversations or whatever it might be. But through podcasting, 100% that is a skill. And again, it's just something that you practice, right? You know,
Yes.
Whenever someone starts a podcast, like, it doesn't have to be perfect. You can, it's something that you'll learn. And I think each guest will teach you, especially when you do have your first guest who is a little more emotional or has more of an emotional story. So I think, you know, it's just one of those things where just do it. It might be clunky. You might mess up, but listen to Lisa's advice and follow what she does because it really works on her show. And I'd love to hear more about, you know, how to keep it. I think the craziest thing that ever happened to me on my other podcast, Employee to Boss, was someone told me the story of giving birth. And it's a business podcast. And I was like horrified. It was so graphic and I had no idea how to reel it back. If it happened to me today, I still have no idea how to reel it back. So what advice do you have on that side of things?
Yeah, so you want to think about, where are you? So for instance, when I was working as a therapist, I was in a room one-on-one with someone, and the whole goal was to help someone process their emotions, to be with their emotions. And sometimes that would mean teaching someone how to regulate their nervous system, and maybe not emote so much depending on their goals. But then there were plenty of times where it was just being with someone who's crying, allowing someone space to feel whatever they feel. That's a very specific environment where when we think about the range of emotional expression, it can be really high. So if we say a 1 is, no emotional expression at all, and a 10 is, someone on the floor in the fetal position just boo-hooing their eyes out, right? So an 8 to 10 is appropriate for that setting. But it's not appropriate necessarily for a podcast. And you want to think about this in two ways. You want to think about your listener and what is your listener coming to your podcast for? And do they want to, is that appropriate for it? And occasionally you might be in a podcast space where that might be appropriate. So I don't want to say it's an all or nothing thing, because it's not. But you don't want to trigger your listeners, but you also don't want to trigger your guest by making them feel so vulnerable that they can't come back from whatever's happening. Because one thing that can happen if someone had a traumatic experience, and I'm curious, like, you don't have to tell me anything about it, but I'm wondering if that birth experience was traumatic for that person.
Oh, it was, yeah.
Yeah, because once someone gets into their trauma and they start telling you their trauma story, it's almost like they're in a trance. And they can just keep going and going and going, and it can get very graphic. And it's like they're there in it, and now you're there in it, and we're all there in it. And then what do we do? How do we pull it back? Yeah. So again, thinking about your body experience. If you're starting to feel uncomfortable, you want to pause, like keep listening to the person, but attend to yourself and say, why am I uncomfortable right now? Is this going outside the range of what the emotional content should be for this podcast? And so for me, I like to keep it somewhere between a 4 and a 7. So it's fine if someone is emoting. It's fine if I'm emoting. And there's been times when I've teared up a little, but it's not so high that I can't reel it back within 3 to 5 seconds. Right? So that can be a nice metric. Like, could we reel it back in 3 to 5 seconds? Or maybe even 30 seconds. You figure out what that metric is for you and for your podcast, but knowing those things in advance can be really helpful, so that if you notice that someone is getting into material that is far afoot from what your podcast is about, and you start feeling like a voyeur, right? Because sometimes a conversation will go in an interesting direction and be like, oh yeah, I think this could work for the podcast. But at other times you're like, I feel like we're getting a little bit too personal. When that happens, you want to say, okay, what can I say to that person to make them feel heard? And how can I have a question in mind that redirects the conversation? And you do this for the sake of your guest as well as for the listener. So if I start feeling that tension inside my body, I'll say, wow, that sounds so hard. Let's hold space for that for a second. And I might, we might pause, or we might have some way of honoring that and say, and then I'm thinking in my head, okay, how can I relate this back to the topic we're talking about? And so I want to ask a question that's not out of left field, but that is a question that maybe is more of a yes or no question. So we're not making it too open-ended, or I'm asking a question that takes it in a slightly different direction.
That is really great advice. Thanks so much for sharing that, because I think, maybe not everyone will have to use that but you never know. Like, I never thought that I would be in that situation. Right. And, I don't mind her telling me it, of course. If you need to get it off your chest, I guess I'll listen. But it wasn't something that made it into the final product of the episode. And right. I did sort of feel bad cutting it out. So it is one of those times where the redirection is important. So thank you so much for sharing those tips. Before we get into my rapid fire section, I'd love to touch a little bit on the marketing of your show because you do a great job. Your show is growing fast. You're getting new listeners. You're having these amazing guests. So beyond just having connections already and guests that you're interviewing, how else are you marketing the show?
So I think number one, I hold space for my guest by making sure that I keep them informed as to what's happening. So I tell them a week in advance, hey, your episode's going to go live. I have an email that I send to them, and it's really a template that I have created. It's like, your episode is going live. Here is the link to the podcast page. So there's a podcast page on my website. There's also a podcast page on Buzzsprout, which is the platform that I run my podcast off of. And so I send them that link. I also give them the link for the YouTube channel version of the episode. So I give them that information. I send them the graphics, and then I give them 5 or 6 very easy tasks that they can do that helps to spread the word. And I also create some copy. So if they're really busy, then they can just copy and paste that into their social media or whatever they're going to put it in. And that way it's very easy for them. So I think that's one thing that I do. I also have a schedule of posts that I put on Instagram. Then I also do some on YouTube. I do feel like I'm still trying to figure out YouTube. Like occasionally I'll have something a short that works really well and I'll go, oh, that was good. But then other times it's not horrible, but it's still something I'm trying to figure out the SEO around. So I do those two things. I also have a Substack that I have a high level of engagement in. And so I make sure that the episode shows up twice. During the week that the episode airs, I have the graphic and I have a description so that people can watch it right then. And then at the end of the month, I have kind of a news roundup of different links and things, and it's always there again. So there are 2 touch points for my most engaged followers to be able to listen to the podcast. And so those are some of the ways. I also talk about the podcast when I'm out and about and, let people know I'm a podcast host and give them the links to the podcast. I bought the domains. So I have writingyourresiliencepodcast.com and .org. And so when you buy the domain, you can very quickly say like, hey, here is the domain, just go listen to it. And it's very easy. And right now I'm starting to transition to using the Buzzsprout version of the website. Like I have it on my website, but what I like about what Buzzsprout does on their webpage is that it lists all of the different ways and it has the follow button, which I have not figured out how to put on my website, but that's just one more way to encourage people to continue to listen is when they're following. So also what I would say if you're starting a new podcast is that think about your intro and your outro and how can you in your outro have a call to action. Like think about the one thing or 1 or 2 things you want them to do, which is usually follow and maybe, give me a nice review. Make sure that that's in the outro for every single episode. So that way you have those CTAs and then thank people. When someone, makes a comment, I thank them. And then I also ask them like, what did you like? So I try to keep that conversation going if I can. And those are some of the ways that I try to market the podcast. And then of course, being on other podcasts like this one.
Yeah. Those are really great tips, and definitely being a guest on podcasts is one of the best ways to grow. I think that's more of a marketing strategy than just promoting. And so having a combination of promoting and marketing are key to growth in podcasting.
Yeah. And really thinking about, from the whole marketing of what you're doing, what things can you do to build trust? What things can you do to court loyalty from, your fans? And then what things can you do that serve as those call to action items that help promote growth and get a greater exposure?
Absolutely. I love all those. Thanks so much for sharing those. Lisa, one more question before we get into the rapid fire section. We work together, right?
Yes.
So I helped you start your podcast and I take over the production side for you so you don't have to worry about the editing. I know a lot of podcasters do try to figure out, do I want to do this by myself? Do I want to hire someone? What was kind of your thought process when deciding to work with me?
Time was a factor because and it was also, it was a time factor and a fear factor. I was afraid that I didn't know how to do these things. And it wasn't that I couldn't figure it out, but I wondered, would taking the time to figure it out either delay this indefinitely or take up so much of my time? And that's important because I'm a writer, so I have to protect my time. And so having you do that piece of it, which is not, that's not my joy piece, right? So thinking about what's my joy, what's not my joy, and anytime I can offload not my joy is helpful. So I thought about it in that way. And the other piece was just, it was the fear piece, and then also just making sure I had time, because I do have a very busy life. I have a lot of things that I'm trying to accomplish. And what I know about all things, whether it's the writing community or business community, is that help is essential. And knowing how to ask for help, how to utilize help, and how to make sure you're choosing the right help is really important.
Definitely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's important for people to hear, because there's no right or wrong way to do it. You could DIY it or you can have help. Really, it's just depending on, like what you just said. Do you have time? Are you holding yourself back? Do you want help, right?
Yeah.
Like that's something too. I mean, if you come to me and you're like, I really don't want help, but like I think I need it, we can have that conversation. Like maybe you don't need help. You know, it's just all up to the podcaster of what's going to work best. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. All right, I have 8 questions for you. We're going to try to rapid fire. I talk a lot, but we're going to try and get through this. So my first question for you is, what was the first podcast you ever listened to?
We Can Do Hard Things.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Besides your own podcast genre, what is your favorite genre to listen to?
I like storytelling podcasts like The Moth and Risk.
Yeah, those are really good. Do you have a dream podcast guest?
I have a current dream podcast guest, and that is Dr. James Pennebaker, because he did all of this research on writing and it gets quoted all the time. So he's one of them, but I'm sure that there are others. Gosh, if I could have Cheryl Strayed on my show, that would be amazing. Or Elizabeth Gilbert.
Okay, I love that. I think you can make that happen, Lisa.
I think I possibly could.
Let's do it. What's one podcast you'd recommend everyone to listen to?
Freelance Writing Direct. I think Let's Talk Memoir and Freelance Writing Direct are 2 excellent podcasts if you are in the writing space, because the interviews are excellent and you always come away learning something new.
Yeah, and I work on both of those shows, so I love that. What is your favorite podcast listening platform?
It depends on what's happening in the podcast. I would say probably Apple Podcasts is the place where I listen most, but sometimes it's important for me to be able to see things, and so then YouTube becomes really important.
Totally. Do you have any podcast listening pet peeves, like things that bother you as a podcast listener?
Poor audio quality. So it's, it doesn't have to be pristine, but I think if the audio is really poor quality, that can affect my listening ability. And then also, if somebody was drinking coffee and like slurping really loud into the into the microphone as like a sound effect, I know someone that did that, and I was like, I don't want that.
I hate mouth noises. I really do. So.
Yeah, the snappies and the
Right. Yes, those kill me. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Yeah. No, same with me. And I think as podcasters, I think we get to be a little bit pickier. So 100% totally understandable. Okay, last 2 questions. What is the best advice you've ever received about podcasting?
The best advice I would say is just do it. Allow yourself to make mistakes. Most of us learn by doing. And if you don't just take the risk of doing, you're never going to get it. You're never going to do it, and then you're never going to learn.
Okay, last one. What is the most surprising thing you've learned about yourself through podcasting?
I think that what you just said about holding space was surprising to me, because sometimes I think I can be a little self-critical, And I'm always listening and saying, okay, how can I do this better? And how can I hold space in a more impactful way? How can I do these things in a way that's more effective? And so hearing you say, like, you're holding space a lot better than other people, or that's a skill that you have, I think that was really surprising. I do think that this has made me a much better speaker. I think about that a lot more than perhaps I did, just because I'm constantly listening to myself because I listen to every episode. But yeah, thank you for telling me that I'm good at holding space for people.
Oh, of course. And you are. You really, really are. So I've loved having you on this podcast. I've never interviewed you before, like we were saying, so I think it's really, really cool to be able to be on the other side. I'm usually on the back end, but Today I got to chat with you. So thanks so much for joining me on the show, Lisa. What's next for you? What topics do you want to explore? What themes are coming up in your podcast? Like, really, what's next for Writing Your Resilience?
I think thinking about all of the ways we can hold space for ourselves and others is actually one of the topics I'm really looking at. And how do we have more strategies for doing that? Really looking at the neuroscience of how we hold space for ourselves. And I'm excited to have some guests on who can talk about specific things like, how do we work with the vagus nerve? Or how do we do some of these other things related to the nervous system? And then I'm very excited about some of the upcoming memoirs that I have on the list.
Oh, very exciting to see what's coming soon. So again, thanks so much, Lisa. Where can the audience connect with you, listen to your show? What are all those good links?
Yeah, so writingyourresiliencepodcast.com is the best way to access the podcast. You can also go to my website, lisacooperellison.com. There's a button right there so you can listen. I'm on Instagram at Lisa Cooper Ellison, same for Facebook. And then there's a long, complicated link for LinkedIn, which I'm going to give you for the show notes, which is Lisa Cooper Ellison and then like numbers / whatever. So I haven't figured out how to change that one. But I'm also I'm on YouTube at Lisa Cooper Ellison.
Yeah, and your YouTube, is growing so fast. So what you're doing is working. I'll have an expert talk about YouTube on the show probably soon, but I totally feel you. YouTube is like a monster that you cannot quite feed properly. That's what I found. So it's changing quick. But I have loved chatting with you, and I hope that everyone comes and listens to your show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for doing this for everyone and for all you do for us podcasters.
Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind-the-scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.